Welcome everyone to Spirit Born Imagining's member highlight show. This is where we really try to uplift and inspire and transform. I'm Mary J. McQueen, and really in this space we celebrate the amazing members of our community, and through heartfelt conversations we get to know the incredible souls behind Spirit Born Imaginings, really their journeys, their passions, and the wisdom they bring. So let's settle in and join us as we explore the stories that connect and uplift us all. And today I am so pleased to welcome to our space and conversation Kate Mollison. And welcome, Kate.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to have a dialogue with you today.
Awesome. And maybe you'd like to share just a little bit about. I know there's probably many avenues for your path, but maybe you would just like to share a little bit about what your work, what inspires you.
Yeah, so that's a very pointed question that has a very broad answer. It depends on how you want to approach it. Um, I was personally widowed 4 years ago, almost 5 years ago. Wow. And I had a lot on my plate, right? Like, we don't have the time for me to give you the whole spiel, but it was a lot more than the average. And the way I phrase it is like, it's like being waterboarded with gasoline, right? It is so much more than just drinking from a fire hose. It is being waterboarded with gasoline. That whole widowhood experience, that whole young widowhood experience, that whole solo parenting, navigating all of the legalities and the red tape and all the things. And I got to the end of the first 2 years and I collapsed. I fell down and I broke apart. And then I stood up and I realized the system failed me and I had to do something about it. Like, I was called to do something about it. And I often say that if I can help one person avoid the experience that I had, then Craig's death wasn't in vain. Um, so the long and short answer that I'm trying to provide you with is the work that I do is I help people find answers. I help businesses navigate bereavement. I help individuals navigate grief. And I help those two parties of people talk to each other and relate to each other and be more harmonious with one another. Because at the end of those 2 years, I realized that the crux of all of the trauma, the second round trauma, the things that I went through, everything that was like catastrophic in my life could be tied back to the fact that I either had to be at work when things had to be done. I didn't have enough sick time or sick leave or whatever to take off. The bereavement leave that they offered me was minimal. I was basically coerced and forced back into work before I was medically ready.
Mm.
And so all of these other pitfalls start to happen. Mental health problems snowball and they exacerbate into physical health problems. And then that, like, I was seeing a cardiologist and three separate psychotherapists at one point. Like,
Wow.
it got to a point where I was damn near mental health crisis because you're just oscillating between like trauma and exhaustion and trauma and exhaustion.
Mm.
But the epicenter of that cycle was the demand to bring in an income, to be away from the home, to be at work, the duty to be at work, the pay that had to be brought in, all of that. That took me 3 years after his death to really identify that that was the crux. Because I initially started just trying to help the individual to martyrdom to some degree, if you will. I tried to save them all because I didn't want the widows to go through what I went through. I didn't want anyone to go through what I went through traumatically. So it just recently dawned on me, actually, that the crux of it was, how do we create that space when bereavement leave ends, which here in the United States, the average is 3 days of paid leave. Three
Wow.
days. My boss at the time was kind enough to give me five, kind enough. And then after that, I exhausted my 2 weeks of PTO, my sick time. Once that 2 weeks was up, I went back to work. 2 days later, my son had severe pneumonia and was in the ICU for 2 days. So I worked the next like 2 weeks basically unpaid if you level it all out.
Yeah.
Like the crux of everything that happened in that cyclical trauma, and even some of the things I went through, potentially could have been prevented. Place had I had a policy that supported the neuroscience behind grief, if I had had a company that understood that grief is an ADA provision, right? So, like, as I'm going through all of this, I'm learning this systemic, holy moly, like, all of the research is there to support it. It's just a matter of how do we help build that bridge between employers and employees. So, kind of a long answer to your question.
No, but it really, Kate and I know each other for quite a while now. We're together, we're really good friends. And just for everybody who doesn't know, I'm Jan Jeremias, the other half of Spirit Born
Yes, I
Imaginings.
apologize. I realized I forgot to talk
Okay,
about
it's
that.
all good. It's all good. And
It's a
so,
Monday.
Yes,
yeah, it's all
exactly.
good. But that when Kate and I met, that was what I found so compelling, was a lot of what she described, was this whole idea of my passion, a lot of my passion, which is, I think, in general, to bring humanity back into the workplace, to bring the fact that we have lives outside of the workplace. And it's not that we don't want to do our jobs, it's just that at points things happen and doing your job is unrealistic. It just isn't, especially being, however, whatever your personal home life situation is. And I was very struck by what Kate had shared with me about her personal experience and knowing different personal experiences that I had gone through. And I think in general, most employers are very ill prepared to
Yes.
deal with any of that, any of that. And we are kind of, it's framed as if that, like, if we do require more time, it's framed as if there's something wrong with us,
Hmm.
or that we're being overly demanding if we say something like, I really need more than 5 days, or we need more, like I need a week, or whatever. It's portrayed as like, oh, you must be like, you must not be serious about your job, and you must not want it badly enough.
It's like loafing, right? Like it's an out or a vacation or like, wow, must be nice to have 3 months off. I'm like, thanks, my husband died. Like people said that to me.
Oh my
People
God.
said that to me. Like, oh, did you do anything fun on your time off? Yeah, planned my husband's funeral. Thank you so much. Like the audacity of some people. And I didn't mean to cut you off, Jan, but to your point, like they are ill prepared. Employers are so ill prepared. And I'm a stats gal. In order to make sense of what was happening to me, I needed to like because it was so unfathomable. It was so ineffable. It was so big. It was undescribable, right? Like the fact that my husband had just poof died, just like poof, magic died. It was so unexpected. Um, I needed to, like a tangible to like make it make sense. And so I started doing all this research, which again, it's not lost on me. Craig was always a stats and Excel and research guy. Like he was a big numbers guy, and I was never that gal. And it took him dying for me to become that gal. So thanks, Craig. But here I am, like, you know, .edus and .orgs, and I'm like deep in a black rabbit hole of science stats. And at the end of it, what I discovered is that we as a country have spent billions of dollars in research data to outline and support what grief looks like from a physiological, neurological, brain chemistry health perspective. We also have done the research to conclude that when your brain isn't working well, you're not working well. There's a productivity disconnect,
Hmm.
right? The next step is to then look into it from a workplace safety perspective. So I always ask people this, like, just imagine, right? So we all know grief is huge and grief has the emotions and it's complex, but it peaks, those cortisol hormones peak at about 5 to 7 weeks after that initial like shock, that loss. You get 3 or 5 days bereavement leave, maybe, maybe a couple weeks, whatever. You go back to work, you're productive, whatever, boom. And then your brain hits that peak and it mimics the signs of early Alzheimer's. So now just imagine someone in this intense level, but it's your neurosurgeon, it's your school bus driver, It's your resource officer at the high school in an at-risk community. It is the single mom taking care of a special needs infant. It is, like whatever the scenario is, it is. So that's the 10,000 foot view, right? Like it is literally putting people's lives at risk to ask them to go back to work and do some of these jobs. The construction worker who's monitoring traffic control. It takes one lapse of synapses and boom, somebody dies. So grief becomes a workplace safety initiative, which is why it's protected under ADA. And most employers don't know that it's ADA protected. But the bigger conversation is about time, right? Like Jan, you kind of touched on this a little bit, is that employers are ill-equipped with how much time it's going to take. And we have the research and we have the data to support maybe shifting the time. But we as a culture need to shift the paradigm that we hold with time. We always think we have more time, right? Like we don't need to do anything now because that's not going to happen to us yet. But yet is like literally around the corner.
Mm-hmm.
And the odds of that happening, sure, are small. But the odds of my husband passing away 2 days before Thanksgiving, day before his birthday, month before Christmas, peak of COVID from medical negligence were pretty minuscule too.
Mm.
Right? Like, and again, that's an extremist example, but that's what happened. I'm the exception to the rule. But I'm what should be used, like what not to do.
Yes.
When we think we have more time, we have to use that time. Time is not just to like lollygag, right? Like it's that old retail worker adage. If you've got time to lean, you've got time to clean. Well, like we've got time and now we need to clean a little bit. And that means having an estate plan, having preparation conversations with loved ones, whether it's aging parents. I'm going through that right now with my father. He had an unexpected brain bleed and it kind of like reality checked all of us very recently. So that's been how have those tough conversations with spouses. If you're old enough to get married, you're old enough to have a will.
Mm-hmm.
If you're old enough to rent a car, you're old enough to have a will. Like, and there's time is such an important conversation because how do you do more than just the paperwork though, right? Like I think back again to my dad and everything, and it's like, how do you use the time we have to build legacy?
Mm-hmm.
And legacy, I think, is a word that gets a bad rap sometimes. Like it's not about being put on a pedestal. It's not about pomp and circumstance. It's not about leaving riches necessarily to your generations. But legacy is about like what you're leaving behind for the people you're leaving behind. The legacy isn't necessarily about you. It's kind of like when you plan a wedding. The wedding isn't for you. It's for everybody else. The legacy is for the other people. How are you giving them the gift of that transformed relationship? Through pictures, through written word, through recordings of your voice or stories or songs, or if you paint, maybe a painting. Like my dad, he draws. And, a couple of years ago, I had him like draw me this big charcoal pencil sketch that he did. And I've got it framed. And like, it means a lot to me because it's a legacy piece from him. So how do we use the time and the lessons? And how do we teach, again, employers, bringing it full circle, how do we teach employers to create space for legacy, whether it be, pictures at the office and personalized workspace, healthy boundaries, a work from home flexible schedule, or is it, do you provide support groups and more hands-on learning and education in the workplace? Those are ways you help people understand how to use their time. So that's my word of the day is time.
Yeah, and I was thinking of like support groups. I was thinking of like having everybody know what you do.
Yeah.
Work so that if you're not there or something happens, like there's coverage. And then maybe employer, like if you are at work, there is a backup system.
Yes.
I love that. Like creating an accountability buddy almost, but like having a shadow, right? They could be someone either job adjacent or job direct or job above, or maybe even as a stretch role, a job below, right? Like as a store manager, when I did retail, I always trained my assistant store manager to do everything that I did. Yes. I made them run my office days occasionally, and I made them like do safe drops, and because I needed to know that in the instance I wasn't able to run the business, the business kept going. Why I didn't do that in my personal life with estate planning, I will never know because I have the skill, but apparently did not literally have the will.
Well, I think it's so interesting because
Sorry,
I
that was
think
a terrible dead joke.
it was, but I think that we don't tend to cross those borders sometimes. We very
Right.
much compartmentalize our life. So we do certain things at work and we do certain things at home. And then it doesn't dawn on us to kind of like have them cross in any way.
Well, I think that's part of the workplace culture that's ingrained, right? Like we are taught from a very young age, from our first employment, like you check your stuff at the door. You do
Oh,
that on your
absolutely.
personal time. You talk about that on your personal, you socialize on your personal time. Like we are taught to
Mhm.
compartmentalize. And so
Absolutely.
when we have a family emergency, something outside of our work bubble that happens, it's without the capacity within the management to understand what's happening because they're so disconnected,
Hmm.
right? Like, and I'm not saying your employer needs to know everything in your personal life, but like just practicing a little self-awareness, a little empathy, a little like, oh, maybe something's going on in their life. Maybe I shouldn't just write them up,
Yes.
or coming in with a micromanagement or coming in with an accusatory, right? Like, how do we reteach managers to seek to understand instead of coming out guns blaring and accusatory? Like, how do we all have to take, sexual harassment training at work. And unfortunately, here in America, gun violence training in workplace, we have to take biohazard training. Like, there's all of these workplace training as you onboard.
Hmm.
Why isn't for the management like mental health awareness of like here's some signs and symptoms of what might be mental health and like how to have tough conversations, like
Well,
how
that's
to
what I
have
was going to
human
say.
101. It's like a 16-slide presentation here, I can give it to you.
Right, right. No, I mean, I was thinking of communication because I think so much of it is like learning how to communicate with people and, um, and heartfelt communication. This whole idea of, understanding
Yeah.
and how do you portray that understanding and how do you make someone feel like you understand? And then allowing people and offering people resources. I think that, have giving people the opportunity to say, this is, knowing one is that border, like that, that boundary of like, okay, this is really a little bit, let's say, too much
What's work appropriate and what's not
or
work
whatever,
appropriate,
right?
right?
Yeah,
Like
kind
there's
of
that
thing.
line. Yep.
Right. But then saying, okay, well, they were, handing them or sending them something that basically tells them a resource which they could go if they need more support on a
So
particular
what I
thing.
love to do in those instances is I train the management staff, whether it be a one leader organization or a 50 leader organization, right? Like everybody gets the same training. What they get taught is to put the power back in the hands of the person who's going through it. Because grief, generally speaking, so much is happening to you, right? Like you're not supposed to do stuff and you have stuff and like it's all stuff coming at you. And then someone's like, well, if you need anything, let me know. And you're just like, right? Like, again, you feel like a John Cena, like you can't see me, like, oh, it's terrible. So instead of doing that, how do you say, hey, Mary Jane, I noticed that you are going through a lot. I know that you've had a loss in your family, and I would love to support you in any way that feels good for you. Would it be acceptable if I took 40% of your workload and had another associate support you with that for 2 weeks? And then in 2 weeks, we can reassess and see how you feel. Ask the question. Like put the power of choice. And it sounds terrible, but to a degree, you have to treat the employee who's going through grief a little bit like a toddler. Like don't be condescending, but limit your choices, right? Like you say, what do you want to eat? I'm going to go, I have no idea. But if you say, do you want Mexican or do you want Italian? I can choose. Say, hey, do you want me to remove part of your workload for this amount of time or not? And they can say yes, but, or they can ask questions, or then there's a negotiation phase that happens. But you put the power of choice, the power of consent, the power of control back into the griever's hands with all of those. Like, hey, I would love to offer you a support group list for local within the area. Like, is that something you would want? Is that something that would be helpful to you? Would you like me to email it to you or do you need a paper copy? like, how do we just kind of like ask? We're not psychics, and I'm not asking management to be psychics. And I'm not even asking anybody to understand grief, right? Like, you can't really understand it until you've experienced it. You can be empathetic to it, you can be adjacent to it, you can sympathize with it, but no one will ever know what it feels like to lose their husband until they lose their husband. I will never know what it's like to lose a parent. I can prepare for it and learn about it and think about it and talk about it, but I won't know until I go through it. So
Exactly.
for people at work, it's not about like understanding or accepting, or it's just about slowing the conversation down, taking time. Again, there's my word of the day, taking some time and asking questions that you really are seeking answers to. Don't do it for compliance, do it for curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
How do we ask? Like, everybody says, "Oh, how are you?" And so your default answer that we're conditioned to give is, "How
Fine.
are you?" What does someone say?
Fine.
Fine.
"I'm fine." But if I were to say, "Jan, how are you right now?" Or "How are you today?"
Mm-hmm.
Mine is always like, how are you really?
Hmm.
How are
I
you?
like to also ask about a specific time in the past, like today's Monday. So I could say, "How was your Saturday?" Give them again, that's, you're not giving them overwhelming choices because their feelings might be overwhelming at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just slowing things down, filtering things down during that peak cortisol crisis, right? And then now we've coached employers to do that. How do we come down the slope? So people are starting to come back into their selves. They're starting to feel more productive. They found a little bit of a routine. We're at like 10 to 12 weeks out post loss. Cortisol hormones have started to levelize. They're eating well. You don't just dump everything back on them and be like, "Okay, I'm out." Like, you're like, "All right, here's your workload back. Let's check in 2 weeks and see how you're feeling." And then offering them that continued, like, I understand that certain times, holidays, or things may affect you. Please communicate with me if there's something I can do to support you. We do have options for a work from home schedule, an intermittent leave, or we can talk to people services, HR, EAP, whatever it is, and see if there are alternatives for you if you need something. So again, you're putting the power back in their hand. You're not enabling them. You're not infantilizing them, but you're also informing them what's available and
Mm-hmm.
then letting them make a choice. But then when they make that choice, you have to honor that choice. Like, let's not micromanage. Let's not performance manage without seeking to understand. Let's continue to ask questions with empathy, like person 101. And it's so blatantly obvious to me now as I teach about this, right? What started as teaching about grief has evolved, has morphed into something so much bigger because it's about teaching empathy. And if you had asked me a year ago if that's what my business was about, I would have told you no, very naively, because we all go through grief, right? Grief isn't intrinsic to death, it's loss. And we've all lost something. You know, like, I love that the emphatic head shake, like that resonates with you so deeply when we reframe it from, we untangle it. Is grief with death? Absolutely. But it's like, sandals can be shoes, but not all shoes are sandals. Where, grief is death, but death is only grief. Maybe scratch that, reverse it. I don't know. Semantics. Down a rabbit hole. Go gadget ADHD. Um, my point being is that grief is so, it's so complex. It's so intrinsic from person to person. So it's about, how do we just empathize? How do we slow it down, right? We've all experienced loss.
Mm-hmm.
Loss can be divorce, right? Like, Jan, there was grief in everything that you went through, right? There's grief in child loss, whether it be a miscarriage or infertility or a stillbirth, or, you know, God forbid, there's child is taken away or whatever. Like, there's grief in that. There's postpartum grief. There's empty nesting, right? When your kids grow up, move away. Now you're an empty nester. There's spouse loss. There's sibling loss. There's parent loss. There's pet loss, right? Like, if you called into work with an emergency and said, oh my God, there's been a death in the family. I can't come in today. Everyone would lose their minds. Oh my God, take whatever time you need, blah, blah, blah. You go back 2 days later and they're like, oh, how's everything? You're like, yeah, really sad. We had to put our dog down. Everyone would look at you like you have three heads. They would accuse you of lying and manipulating. And I'm like, so bereavement leave doesn't count for dogs. Like I'm not allowed to have grief when I put my dog down, and I've known the dog. I'm closer to the dog than I am with Aunt Mildred, who lives 300 miles away, and I only see twice every 2 years. I don't actually have an Aunt Mildred, just for those who are curious. I digress, right? Like again, and I like to make these extreme examples because I want to point out the ridiculousness of it when people go, there's no such thing, or grief isn't real, or right? Like it is real because we've all had it. Your best friend from childhood moves away, right? We've all seen that dramatic 90s movie where the opening scene is they're separated. Oh, grief. Your college roommate gets a job and goes away, right? Like there's grief. You put a hole in your favorite sweater. If that is your only experience with loss, there is still attachment and connection, and in that instance, sentimental value, but placed value on that relationship, there's still grief.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I was like, welcome to my TED Talk.
No, I was just thinking, it's like it's so important because whether it's within a corporate or work environment, or even if you're just meeting one-on-one out in the world with people, we never know what's going on behind the scenes, and there could be so many other things. And I think the what you're speaking to, at least from what I see, is like, approaching things with empathy and compassion. And being
Yeah.
willing just to not solve, not to fix, just to listen and to assist if that's what's needed. What was it, Jan? You were talking the other day about the three H's.
Yeah, Kate knows my favorite, the three
Oh, I
H.
love these.
Yeah, do you need to be heard? Do you need help, or do you need a hug? Um, and Yeah, and I think the one word you left out, Mary Jane, and this is your word, is kindness.
Yes.
Mm.
Treating people with kindness. And
It costs nothing to be kind. Like, and it's not kindness again, I feel like is another word that gets a bad rap because it's all blown out of like to be kind has to be some big grandiose gesture. Like making small talk with the cashier at the grocery store when they are trying to initiate with you. Like, just put your phone down, be kind. Like the other day I was at, I think, Walmart, and there was a long line. It was one cashier, it was an older gentleman. It was like a very small little spot to put the groceries. So I start bagging my own groceries, and he's like, man, like you don't have to do that. I'm sorry I'm going so slow. And I was like, absolutely not. I have zero problem bagging my own groceries because one, it helps you. Two, it helps me. Like, it's like, well, most people are like, well, this is what I pay you for. And I'm like, it costs nothing. It
Yes.
costs nothing. Like, just be kind. You don't, that
Yes.
barista at the coffee shop, like, they're grumpy with you, whatever. Like, somebody cut you off in traffic. Like, maybe their dog died. You don't know. Like,
Exactly. Yeah,
yeah,
and I know for my own scenario, I mean, I've also experienced grief with parent
hmm,
loss and things and family loss, but I mean, I had an extended grieving period when I was restructured out of my job after 31 years. It was so
yeah,
intrinsically part of who I perceived myself to be that I thought, okay, who am I now?
yeah. It was this established identity, right?
Right. So
Yeah.
I love that word because that's what I was listening to something the other day, and that's what basically they were talking about. He was talking about is anytime we have a perceived identity and we lose that identity, basically for some whatever reason that is, you know, we experience loss. As if we've identified as something, if you've identified yourself as a daughter, when you lose a parent, all of a
Mhm.
sudden you're like, who am I now? I mean,
Yeah.
I had that when my dad died. It was kind of like I was always daddy's little girl. And I thought, oh my gosh, I don't have a father anymore. So what does that exactly mean now?
Mhm.
It's a huge, like, identity is such an intrinsic part of grief as well. And I think that that's a piece that gets really lost, right? when people interact with us post loss, whatever it is, sometimes they don't know how to interact with us because we are different. They are grieving that we are no longer the version we used to be. And that's a weird, Schrodinger's cat type situation. We're both the griever and the grieving at the exact time. But it's that relationship building and that capacity to empathize, and that I lost my train of thought, but what I'm trying to say is that grief is such a horse of a different color, and it is so personal, right? Like it's very much kaleidoscopic, where it is such a fractured individual vision, right? For each person looking through their viewfinder. But we all know what it looks like to look through a kaleidoscope, right? And we may see different things in our mind's eye as we envision it, but we all know what it feels like to hold the kaleidoscope in our hands, to look through it, to see the refracted colors. So we may not see it through the same lens, but we all have the capacity to relate similar information. And we seem to forget that in any other capacity, right? When it comes to grief, we forget that person to person. We forget that boss to employee. We forget that even parent to child, right? Like, again, with the whole stuff going on with my dad, there's been some power dynamic struggle with my mom, and there's grief in that. And there's grief in that. And like, it's just this big tornado of grief in my life right now. So, I just thought it would be a great idea to make it my job. Being a little cheeky now. No, I do actually think like I'm honored that it's my job and it's my calling and it's my passion. I'm sure that part comes through very true, is that I'm passionate about this.
Absolutely.
Because thank you. Because it's important, right? Like, I'm passionate about it for a couple reasons. I'm passionate about it because I have personal resonance with it. It is something that's happened to me, and I have relatable drive. I'm passionate about it because there's science behind it. Ever in Craig's honor, the data is there, that there are better ways that are already happening. There are more things we can learn. There are different things we can do. There's more work to be done. And I would be remiss to be an inactive bystander in that, right? Like we know that something's happening, there's a fight happening, and we don't do anything. We just stand there. Like, I have all this at my footsteps, and I go, oh, I can't unknow this now. Guess I have to do something with it because no one else.
Now I must share it. Now I must share it.
Yes, there's a civic duty to not gatekeep to a degree.
Exactly.
And I'm passionate about it because it can, without sounding arrogant, it can change people's lives, right? We will be able to use that time, to enjoy that time that we have so much of, that we all tend to misuse or micromanage or waste or whatever. But how do we like just get the paperwork out of the way? How do we make it an easier, clearer path? How do we just be nice to each other and then enjoy the time that we have? Absolutely. Just enjoy the time. Put those things in place to just enjoy the time.
Exactly.
Because grief is so much, this is going to sound really sick and twisted. It is so much more beautiful and so much more sweet. Grief is sweeter when you embrace it. And I don't say that without it tasting a little bit like vinegar. But grief, it's that battle that we have that we expect to like get back to normal and get over it. And like, right back to that identity question of who am I? And like, oh, I'm me. But like everything, the foundation is shaken. So how do you rebuild the foundation with broken concrete? All right, well, we're going to lay bricks, and we figure that out. And it's literally like starting over. But once you accept and embrace and use it as empowerment, that grief is never going away. Once you accept that, and that's not a negative thing, right? Like that sounds terrible and like wearing cement brick boots for most people, I'm sure. But like once you just accept that it's part of who you are cellularly, literally now, it allows you breathing room. Yes. It takes that pressure to go back to normal off, and you get to just be. Grief literally removes the laws of physics. And once you understand that they no longer apply to you, you get to craft your own reality. You get to be in the driver's seat of your life in a way that you could not have been before.
That
You
was a
really do
huge,
get to design your own life once
I
you
remember,
accept grief.
sorry, Kate.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. I'm over here rambling.
No, I was thinking to myself, I remember once getting to the point where I realized that it was never going to go back to what it was,
Mm,
as much as I wanted it to, as much as I wanted to kind of push pause and replay or just, restart whatever the scenario was, you know,
yeah.
I was now a different person and there was no going back. And I think I fought that for a long time, or that realization took me like a while to come to,
Which
where
is
I was,
totally normal, by the way.
where I
Hmm.
did a lot of different things to think to myself, okay, if I do this, I'll feel more myself again. I'll
Mm,
go back to who I was. But there is no going back. And
no.
and so much of what you shared, I think what resonates with me, because we're all solopreneurs here,
Hmm.
is this idea of allowing ourselves the same grace when we go through something. I think as a solopreneur, well, I know I can speak to you both about this, that, with all its gifts, it's challenging because if you don't do it, it doesn't get done.
Hmm.
Yep.
And so it's not like, and so all of a sudden, when you're unwell or when you go through things, you have to put things on pause and say, okay, I have to get this done, or this is my priority right now, and I can't do what I thought I was going to do. But I think sometimes, even with no matter what we're going through in life, whether it be illness or loss, we don't allow ourselves that kind of compassion,
Mm,
and
And
we don't
grief.
allow ourselves that grace, our word, Mary Jane, grace,
Yes.
to be able to give ourselves time, to be able to, your word, Kate, time, to be able to like not run ourselves ragged, to
Hmm.
allow
mm.
ourselves to be human beings versus human doings.
I love
And
that.
we just have to learn how to do that same thing with ourselves, because you know sometimes we're our own worst critic or our own worst um you know kind of what word am I looking for, cheerleader. Like
Mm,
we tend to be ride ourselves so high and set these kind of,
critic. Yeah, we tend to
yeah,
criticize ourselves.
and we set such lofty goals which are inhuman, like which are not humanly possible, which I've been talking about a lot as I
I'm not
really
a perfectionist, traumatized child. What are you talking about?
exactly, exactly.
Feeling a little attacked, Jan. Okay.
I think we're all in that
I was
same.
just gonna say, like, ooh, hashtag triggered. Like,
Oh my
but you're
goodness.
right. No, you're absolutely right.
Wow. This has been a really awesome conversation, Kate, and I just want to encourage whoever happens to be listening, that they take the opportunity to connect with you, and what are some great ways that people can connect with you and learn a little bit more about your work if they'd like to do that as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that. Primarily, my presence is on LinkedIn. You can search Kate Mollison. I should pop up if you're connected with Jan, or I think even you, Mary Jane, then they'll be able to find me. Um, I made a joke earlier about doing a TED Talk. I actually have done a TED Talk. So if you go to YouTube and you search for Preparing for the Unthinkable, my TEDx from this past December should pop up as well.
Wow.
And then they can go right to my website, which is my business name abbreviated. So my business name is On Tuesdays We Wear Black. So the website is OTWWB.com, and they can reach out to me there, schedule a one-to-one with me, or just check out my blogs, resources, and read what I'm about.
That's so awesome. Yeah, we'll definitely be including some information of how to reach out to you as well in the comments for the video when we upload it to YouTube. So I look forward to being able to do that. But
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me and for indulging my, grief-ridden ADHD passionate trauma brain. So,
I love it. It was an awesome conversation.
oh,
Yeah, yeah. So thank you for joining us for this inspiring conversation. on the Spirit Born Imaginings member highlight show. We hope you found the wisdom, connection, and a spark of inspiration. If you love this conversation, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss an uplifting story. We also store all our Friday conversations that we have, our discussions and meditations on that channel. And remember, keep shining, keep growing, and keep transforming. Until next time, I'm Jan Jeremias and
I'm
Mary
Mary
Jane.
Jane McQueen. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Kate.